Hello, welcome to Justin's Morning Coffee. This is a coffee cup from the La Scala Opera House in Milan. One of the things that I like to do when I travel is I always buy a coffee cup from wherever I'm. If it's the first time I've been to a city or a country, I always bring home a coffee cup to remind me of where I've been. And this one is very near and dear to me. My trip to Italy, I always love my trips to Italy, but this was my very first one and my very first Italian opera at La Scala Opera House. So what I want to do today is do a little bit of an introduction to why I think documentary film is important, why it is an emerging, an ongoing, emerging in popularity, an ongoing art form that is very profound, that is worth your time. This is the pitch that I want to make to you. Even if you're not a filmmaker, even if you're not an artist yourself, even if you're not a cinephile, but to that paying attention to documentary film and what's going on in documentary film is important, not just because it's interesting, which it often is, but because the process of interpreting the world through the lens of a camera really, in a lot of ways, mimics and mirrors the way that we make meaning in our lives. So it's a meaning-making activity, and I think that it's important to look at how meaning is achieved in these documentary films. And the more you sort of get into it and the more you sort of explore it, the more I think you're going to be able to understand about the human condition. So with that very modest introduction, I want to sort of go over what I think is going on with documentary films. Now, a lot of people, they watch a documentary. They'll say to me, I watch documentaries on Netflix. I'm always interested in documentaries. You know, it's kind of the same type of person that might say, well, you know, I read a lot of nonfiction books, something like that. You know, I like the reality. I think it's interesting. But oftentimes I get the same people or the same question from similar people saying, I like documentaries, but I don't know why. I don't really know what makes a documentary film good, you know. And in my studies, you know, when I was in grad school studying documentary, or when I've sort of encountered conversations about documentary film, there's this kind of circling around trying to define what it is, you know, and what makes it good is really in a lot of ways dependent on how you define what it is, you know. So authenticity, honesty, reality, truth, facts, you know, all of these things are kind of surrounding the medium, and everybody has kind of different rules or different theories maybe about what makes a documentary successful, what makes it good. I'm going to show you a short example of a documentary film that I think is a poignant kind of short film that deals with some issues that I think are very profound and very deep, and does it in a way that's enjoyable to watch. So let's take a look.
The world is predicated upon mending what is broken. And this reality of how the kintsugi bowl is more valuable than the original really speak to the restorative, redemptive process of the gospel. Kintsugi is this art form of mending broken shards of pottery. Kin means gold and tsugi means to mend, so you are reconnecting the broken pieces, but doing it in a way that is beautiful, and it's an art form of its own. Kintsugi speaks about conditions of trauma and brokenness, ground zero conditions. Valuing what you have rather than this disposable culture. Kintsugi is not just fixing, but it's creating into an opportunity of brokenness. And so that is a redemptive journey that leads to new creation.
で10年ぐらい前からワークショップはやってたんですけど、やっぱり震災が一度あってね、311の時に、その後すごい注文が突然増えたんですよ。だけど結局ちょっと落ち着いた時に何を直そうかっていうと、意外とみんな直したかったのは器なんですよね。なんか例えば家が流されちゃっても器だけ残っちゃったりするんですよ。だけどその傷を自分自身の傷を直すのは難しいけど、器を直したりするとなんかちょっと修復されたような気持ちになるっていうのがあると思うんですよね。
そういうコミュニケート、その自然体でいることがアートとその金継ぎっていうものと、やっぱり安全地帯、そのものがある力が癒す力で、
直してると全然違う感じがちょっとしますよね、やっぱりね。なんか直してるっていうよりも何か作ってることにちょっと近づいてる感じの、その中間ぐらいのイメージですかね。
そうですよね、両方でしょ、やっぱり直してるんだけど新しいものを考えてるっていう。
なんか完璧なものってやっぱちょっとそこから先がない気がするんだけど、不完全なものってやっぱすごく嬉しいですよね。完璧なところには完璧なものが収まるし、ちょっと不完全なところには不完全なものがやっぱ引き寄せられるみたいなのがあると思います。だから器を買いに行っても僕は欠けてる器しか買わないんですけど、今欠けてるものにすごく異常な美しさみたいなのを感じるっていうか。
Kintsugi concept can be applied in many different ways. We say we fix the soil, which means not to restore the soil but to amend it. Right? So you add elements to it that makes the soil come alive. So when you plant something in there, it thrives. That's an interesting parallel because understanding the health of the earth already has elements of kintsugi in it.
金継ぎっていうのは単なる修理じゃないんですよね。すごく時間と時間をくっつけたり、記憶と記憶をくっつけたりする特別な魔法みたいな感じがするんですよ。
Creative minds fix upon these traumatic events in history. If you removed all of the novels and art forms that came directly out of trauma, you would lose 80% of world's art. You would not have Hemingway, you would not have J.D. Salinger, you would not have Dante, you would not have Milton. The world would be decimated. It's a very significant way of understanding art and literature, and more importantly, our communities and a way of processing the past, finding healing, to be able to sow seeds of hope in the midst of conflict. We tend to want to run away from these conflicts and traumas, but it is the very heart of what the arts represents.
そうやって金継ぎをずっと続けることによって、本当に世界の見え方が全部変わってくる感じがすごいするんですよ。完璧に仕上げるよりもちょっと未完成な方が、さっきまでボロボロだと思った器に黄金の川が流れてるっていう風に自分が感じるようになってくるんですよね。
Kintsugi reminds us that sometimes instead of throwing away things of the past, that it's good to work to mend, and to do it beautifully. To me, how the gospel reads is Christ came not just to fix us, but to restore us, to create something new, which is more valuable than what we began with.
Every time I watch that film, I see something more in it. There's so much going on with this. One second. With this film. That's Mako Fujimura. Mako is a fine artist, a Japanese American fine artist, and he's really influenced me a lot in how I think about art. He's been one of the major players in the dialogues between people of faith and artists, being big in the fine art world. He's got a lot of influence, a lot of friends all over the place, and so he brings the people together in these conferences called culture care conferences that are just amazing conversations. This film was a combination of some of the conversations at a culture care conference and this sort of journey to Japan to explore this ancient traditional Japanese art form called kintsugi. And kintsugi is the art of taking usually pottery, something that's been broken, and repairing it in such a beautiful way with those rivers of gold. And it's a very profound concept of how beauty can come out of brokenness, right? Now, you could go to a museum and you could see one of these kintsugi bowls and you might find it interesting, but here in the documentary film, we've got examples of the kintsugi, right? We've got interviews with the actual artist, and it's all through the eyes of Mako himself, in a very short and small package, right? That really, I think, just helps you enter in to a dialogue about and a reflection upon this very profound art form. So that's an example of what I'm talking about in terms of the power of documentary film. I'm sure that we could sit here and we could talk about that film and the concepts in that film for at least an hour, or if not more, right? So what is the actual task of documentary film? Here's a filmmaker that says the real challenge for a filmmaker is to take a story that seems banal and tell it in such a way that it becomes exemplary. That's a very interesting statement to me. The idea that you can take something that we might overlook, that might seem ordinary, right? But by focusing the attention of the camera, sort of focusing the frame and the camera lens on to your subject, you can really uncover things that are quite profound. But that phrase exemplary, that is very interesting, because what that says is that you're really operating, I think, in the world of the symbolic, right? You're looking for something that is representative or exemplary or archetypal or prototypical, like we have all these words for a particular represents something larger, right? So the individual anecdote in the documentary film represents something larger, right? So the kintsugi bowl, which is a particular art form, right? What does it represent in that film? It represents, for Mako Fujimura, it represents the idea of the possibility of redemption, right? This is a example. And notice how he connected it then to the soil. He connected fixing, right? Fixing the bowl and fixing the soil. And then he finally says, it's not really fixing, it's transcending, right? The bowl is more beautiful after having been broken, after having gone through that trauma, than it would have been if it never was broken in the first place, right? The seed that goes into the soil in his garden, needs to die before it can be reborn again. So it's tapping in to this very, very deep principle of redemption and rebirth, right? through this one example. So that's kind of what the art form does, I think. It lends itself to symbolic thinking, or at least that's what I want to try to convince you of that idea. The crazy thing is that this idea that you can focus on something completely banal and it becomes exemplary, right, is so true. A documentary film can be about absolutely anything. And if it's done well, you're going to walk away with thinking that it was super profound and super interesting. I'm going to show you just a couple examples of trailers of documentaries that you would think there's no way you could make a documentary about that and have it be interesting. But sure enough, it's interesting. Here's one example.
Maybe you shouldn't have bought your kid that Range Rover. Maybe you should have, just thought about it a little while, because we see why your kid's a bastard.
Whenever somebody asks me, what do you do? I mean, my first inclination is to laugh, you know?
No one's parents look down at the crib of their newborn child and says, God, I wish my son or daughter grows up to be a parking lot attendant.
If this wasn't just a job, this is a holy mission. We are going to park the car. We will park them on the beaches. We will park them on the hillsides. We will park them until there are none to be parked.
And so I'm trying to slam his head into the steering wheel. That was the moment when I realized that maybe I had to adopt a different approach.
This is my job. This is how I make my money. I don't know what you do for a living, but I mean, you owe me $9 right now.
It's more than a parking lot there. The way it's set up, like you're not just taking money, like you're in some sort of battle with humanity or something.
I was like, this is what's wrong with the world. You got a sports car with an automatic transmission.
So, case in point, a movie about parking lot attendants, right? Notice all of the phrases that they were using. This is not just a movie about a parking lot. This is about a battle with humanity, right? This is a holy mission, this parking lot, right? There's all of these transcendent words. And this is coming from the subjects of the documentary, right? So there's a real sense that parking lot represents something more. What does it represent in the film? Well, I mean, it represents maybe the conflict between, one of the phrases that they talk about is that when you buy a car, it doesn't come with its own parking space. And people would get upset at these guys that they were getting charged to park somewhere. And it's like they have a really nice car, but that doesn't mean that you can park it wherever you want, right? So there's this kind of like pushback against the entitlement of someone who owns a really nice car. It was a parking lot next door to a university, and so a lot of these parking lot attendants were already thinking kind of in philosophically profound ways, and so this filmmaker was just drawing it out, right? But isn't it interesting that it can be about a parking lot and it can have these really, really kind of weighty themes, right? Okay, here's another example of what I like to say a documentary can be about anything.
This is cassette 1, track 1, Notes on Blindness. July the 5th, 1984. What happens to the brain when optic stimulation ceases? I am concerned to understand blindness. The pictures in the gallery of my mind have dimmed somewhat. So I could no longer remember easily what my wife looked like, or what my daughter Imogen looked like.
I began to be terribly afraid that I would lose you.
Everything was drifting away. How could this happen to me? Who had the right to deprive me of the sight of my children at Christmas time? Now I find that there's been a strange kind of change in the state of my brain. There is something so totally purging about blindness that one either is destroyed or renewed. I think I am beginning to understand what it's like to be blind.
So, isn't that interesting? This is a film about a theologian living in the 1980s who went blind, and he would do audio cassette tapes, recordings, called Notes on Blindness, right? And he would record these and kind of very, very reflective, profound thoughts about, his state of existence. And the film is basically taking those tapes, taking those recordings, and constructing a world, a filmic world, a visual world around it using, casted actors, just like you would in a fiction film, locations, big budget cinematography, special effects, right? But the audio track are these words recorded from this one person, right? So there's a try to think, maybe let's say those tapes are sitting around somewhere in somebody's attic. Someone discovers them. Wow, these tapes are amazing, and listens to them, right? That person listens to them, but you never really would get, a chance to reflect on such a these kinds of profound thoughts unless it was packaged somehow, right? Packaged into a form like this, right? So the documentary is really doing us a service, doing us a favor. I like to talk about it as giving us a gift, right? And what's the gift? Well, the gift is that this filmmaker went and found this golden nugget, right? Found this little piece of insight, found these tapes, and then basically kind of curates it and gives it to us in an aesthetically pleasing form that will leave you changed after you've seen it. The crazy thing about this is that there was these moments in those reflections where he was reflecting on whether or not the world, that the people who can see can learn anything from someone who's blind, right? Is there a sense that he can see deeper quote unquote, deeper into reality because he's blind than those of us who rely on our eyes, right? And that's a very profound thought. It is true that the other senses become more acute, more sensitive, more when you pay more attention to something, and it's sort of the hearing that he had, the sense of touch that he had, you could say is better, just from practice than those of us that rely on our eyes, right? But just a lot of really, really interesting, profound thoughts, and a beautiful film. I cannot recommend a better way, a more healing way to spend an evening than watching a film like that, right? So that's another example, of how a documentary can be anything. Now here's some filmmakers talking about why they were drawn to documentary film and what they found so profound about this medium.
Are we rolling? I love to go to the movies, but it never occurred to me that I could ever make movies. In fact, I went to undergraduate school in engineering, which I hated from day one.
I mean, it just sort of happened.
Before making films, I worked as a professional chef, and I did that for about 10 years.
À 25 ans, j'ai d'abord fait peut-être 2 ou 3 fois le tour du monde avec une caméra.
When I was 14, I knew I would make films. I started to develop stories and screenplays and was always chased out of offices of producers.
As a 16-year-old, it seemed to me that it would be a waste of time to be a writer. The majority of the population wouldn't be able to read what I wrote. And I loved going to films even then. I thought films was really my medium.
So I became an editor at first because it was that darkness I liked.
Starting out right as a psychologist. In science, you learn to be open-minded. Very important in making a documentary.
J'ai vu Chronique d'un été. Quand j'ai vu Chronique d'un été, je me suis dit, c'est ça que je veux faire.
My first job on a documentary shoot was, here's the Nagra, you're recording sound, and I was like, oh my God.
Working with that amazing dance with people in the frame.
You'd go to lunch and you would talk about it. There was just this great kind of immersion in the adventure of it, which I found incredibly appealing.
It was astounding. And I just fell in love.
And then I went to film school. And I dropped out of film school, but that's another story.
So that's a great little film called Capturing Reality, which is has made about 10 years ago, 12 years ago maybe, that had all of the really marquee documentarians at the time. But there's a sense that they're drawn, I think, to this interplay between the reality that is in front of their lens and then the interpretive process, right? It's, what does this mean? I'm observing with the camera, but what does it mean? What's the significance of it, right? Very interesting, very interesting. And that's why I sort of want to suggest that it's worth looking at this process even if you're not a filmmaker. I mean, it's definitely worth looking at it if you are a filmmaker. And there's some sense that everybody's a filmmaker in some ways these days because of the media technology that we have. Everybody has a phone and everybody is documenting this or documenting that. So maybe it's even worth it. Maybe you could say that we're all documentarians. But it's worth looking a little bit at how the history of documentary film, how these things developed over time, what were the different approaches historically in the history of cinema that people took to explaining, interpreting, finding meaning, finding thematic material, finding purpose in the capturing of reality through the miracle of film, right? This is a book, if you want to know sort of the history of documentary genres. Introduction to Documentary by Bill Nichols is kind of the quintessential textbook for that. And the question is, and I just want to show you guys a little bit of the different kinds, the different styles of documentary that should help you sort of understand what the traditions have done over time, right? So I'm gonna go over quickly these these different categories, right? These are if you go into a vintage video store, there's one down the street here called Videotech. It's one of the old school video rental houses, independent and foreign, and documentary art house movie rental places, right? These are the categories that they'll use, right? As if you read a textbook or a history of documentary film, these are the categories: expository, cinema verite, point of view, interview, and abstract/poetic. Right. So what are those, and how did they develop? That's what I'm going to want to go over with you right now. Okay, so expository is the first category. That's Ken Burns right there. And you can think of expository as your typical PBS style documentary, right? When you think about documentary when you were a kid or when you were growing up, and kind of like the ones that they would have on PBS talking about historical events, right? Presented almost like an essay where you have an authoritative narrator. Sometimes it's a celebrity narrator, sometimes it's just someone with a deep, resonant voice. And then you have the B-roll, the material, the visuals that are complementing whatever the narrator is saying, right? So that's sort of the idea of the first kind of documentary, expository. Here's Ken Burns. This is an example from his famous baseball series of sort of what the formula is for an expository documentary.
Between 1940 and 1950, penicillin was introduced, and the atom was split. Orson Welles made his masterpiece, Citizen Kane. Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma opened on Broadway. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president a third time and a fourth. Overshadowing everything was a world war that would cost more than 55 million lives. Walter Johnson and Joe Tinker and Johnny Evers died. Nolan Ryan and Reggie Jackson and Pete Rose were born.
Castro pitches, Williams swings, there's a high.
Before America joined the war, baseball had a summer better than anyone could ever remember. Almost overnight,
So, as you can see, the narrator basically drives the story, right? So you've got a script, basically, a voiceover script, and the narrator is telling you the story of what happened to baseball in the past. And then, of course, the documentarian gathers the historical archive footage, the still photos, some historical music, perhaps, etc., and puts that over the narrative, right? And so that's kind of you can think of it almost like as a filmed essay or a filmed nonfiction history book, something along those lines. Now, the method for this, right? The method is to research, whatever it is that you're documenting, write a treatment, gather the B-roll material, gather the archive footage, and then edit to a preconceived plan, basically probably recording the voiceover first and then putting in the visuals. And so the emphasis is on the research and the pre-production. That's the methodology for this style, right? Now, this style, I think, has gotten a bad rap for a lot of reasons. It's sort of seen as kind of dry, maybe a little bit too. The narrator is sort of telling you what to think. So maybe a little bit condescending. Et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a lot of times when I talk about documentary, I say, I like to make documentaries. They'll think, isn't that kind of boring? Isn't that this? Isn't it that? that comes from this style. But I actually think that Ken Burns is a brilliant filmmaker, and as well as his brother Rick Burns. Rick Burns did something like a 20-hour history of the city of New York for PBS, and I love that docuseries. I really love it. I mean, I learned so much about American history and about the history of New York from that series. So this kind of filmmaking is very good. Here's Ken Burns talking about how he approaches this historical material, because again, it's all about the interpretation, right? You've got events in the past, and they're all factual, they're all real events, but which ones, what's the order you're going to tell it in? What's the most important? What's the most significant? And again, it's going towards the emblematic. I'm going to show you an anecdote. I'm going to show you, Ken Burns says, a series of episodes in the past because I think it means something today, right? So it's exercising in this arena of meaning making, right? Interpreting reality.
The common stories, 1 + 1 = 2. We get it. But all stories are really, the real genuine stories are about 1 and 1 = 3. That's what I'm interested in. We live in a rational world. We're absolutely certain that 1 and 1 = 2, and it does. But the things that matter most to us, some people call it love, some people call it God, some people call it reason, is that other thing where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that's the 3. Oh, great story. They're all everywhere. There are millions of them. Abraham Lincoln wins the Civil War, and then he decides he's got enough time to go to the theater. That's a good story. The stories that I like to tell are always interesting because the good guys have really serious flaws and the villains are very compelling. My interest is always in complicating things. Jean-Luc Godard said, "Cinema is truth 24 times a second." Maybe. It's lying 24 times a second, too. All the time. All story is manipulation. Is there acceptable manipulation? You bet. People say, "Oh boy, I was so moved to tears in your film." That's a good thing? I manipulated that. That's part of storytelling. I didn't do it disgenuinely, I did it sincerely. I am moved by that too. That's manipulation. Truth is, we hope, a byproduct of the best of our stories. And yet, there are many, many different kinds of truths. And an emotional truth is something that you have to build. And I think that the kind of narrative that I subscribe trusts in the possibility that people could change. I hope it's a positive version of manipulation, but I do think that we do coalesce around stories that seem transcendent. I don't know why I tell stories about history. I mean, there's kind of classic dime store, Ken Burns, wolf at the door things. My mother had cancer all of my life. She died when I was 11. There wasn't a moment from when I was aware, 2.5, 3, that there was something dreadfully wrong in my life. It might be that what I'm engaged in a historical pursuit is a thinly or perhaps thickly disguised waking of the dead. That I try to make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and Louis Armstrong come alive, and it may be very obvious and very close to home who I'm actually trying to wake up. We have to keep the wolf from the door. You know, we tell stories to continue ourselves. We all think an exception is going to be made in our case and we're going to live forever. And being a human is actually arriving at the understanding that that's not going to be. Story is there to just remind us that it's just okay.
Wow. He said so much in there. So, why do we tell stories about the past? I mean, it means something. He's specifically choosing anecdotes from the past that he said are what? Transcendent, right? He's choosing anecdotes from the past that are relevant today because they are examples of transcendence. They're examples of hope. It's this idea that maybe things are going to be okay, because look at what happened in the past. Look what Jackie Robinson did in the past, right? That was all the images there. So he's bringing hope into the world, right? So he's looking, and this is the amazing thing. We're always looking around for examples, for anecdotes that we tell to other people. Think about yourself, right? Think, what are the stories that I tell to other people? You know, when someone, you know, when I'm at a party or when I'm over to somebody's house for dinner or whatever, I'm choosing anecdotes to tell for a reason. What's the reason, right? Maybe if they're anecdotes about your own past, your own life, right? What you're doing is you're constructing a narrative of your life up to now, and you're putting in those major events, right? When someone says to you, what do you do when you meet them at a party or when you're first introduced? What they're asking is, what is the narrative? What are the facts? What are the anecdotes of your life that have a relevance to who you are? Because that's who I want to know. I want to know who you are. So tell me what those anecdotes are. And the anecdotes that you choose will say something about what you think your story is, and then which will mean something about who you think you are, right? So what he's doing is not boring. You know, what he's doing is fundamental, I think, to how we as human beings make sense of our lives. And then he's talking about mortality. You know, we all die. Why did he mention that? The story, in some sense, is a way to transcend your mortality, right? Because you're part of a story that started in the past, and that story continues up to now, and now you're part of that story, and that story will continue on after you, right? So as you tap in to that narrative, your life is getting sort of subsumed into this larger arc, this larger thing. And the process of having to go and make a documentary about the past, okay, he's thinking to himself, I'm going to make a movie about baseball. What are the most relevant anecdotes? Because there's 162 games a year by all of these teams over, you know, decades and decades. What stories are you going to pick? You know, I want to say to you that this is very important. How you decide what you're going to pick is how you think about meaning, how you think about purpose, how you think about, you know, telos, you know, and it relates to not only your life today, but as Ken Burns is saying, like your life after you die even. Very interesting.
You know, the common story.
Okay, so this style, the expository style, again, the method is that you research, look for those anecdotes in the past, prepare the material, write a voiceover script, and then present that, right? And again, I still think of this always as a gift. You're going into the past and you're finding meaning, you're finding purpose from all of that material in the past, and you're pulling it into today's frame, and you're presenting it. Here, this is where we've come from. This is where we're going, right? So that's the service that he's presenting for us. All right, so one of the things that people found out very early on in the film world, as this technology developed in the 20s and 30s and 40s, was that that emotional manipulation that he was talking about. We can talk more about legitimate versus illegitimate manipulation, right? But on the surface, people in power in the 1930s and 40s realized that that emotional manipulation can be used for political purposes, right? And so there's a real history of propaganda bound up with the history of documentary film. Now I'm going to show you a little piece of a series that you can watch on Netflix that really explores this, called 5 Came Back. 5 American filmmakers that were sort of enlisted in the U.S. Army to counter the propaganda that was coming out of Nazi Germany, with Leni Riefenstahl and Joseph Goebbels, under the direction of Adolf Hitler. The question here really is, what is the difference between legitimate and illegitimate manipulation? So I'm gonna play the trailer here so you can kind of get a sense of it, and then we'll talk about it.
Stop thinking and follow me, cried Hitler. I will make you masters of the world.
A lot of people laughed. He was a clown, but they weren't so evil. It was a comedy.
America stands at the crossroads of its destiny.
In the early years of Hitler's rise, moviegoing had become an essential part of American culture. But Americans did not realize the extent of the threat Hitler posed.
He understood cinema could be put in the service of propaganda.
Americans realized we can't win this war. These guys are gonna beat us.
Western civilization was at stake, and we're going to fight until we win.
5 filmmakers wanted to respond as so many millions of men and women responded. They chose to serve.
These documentaries were powerful for American audiences.
The footage proved that the enormity of the task was worth it.
We had an enormous story to tell. The greatest heroes, the greatest villains on the world stage.
This was real filmmaking.
This is the people's war. It is our war.
These 5 men, they were saying goodbye to families who never knew if they would return.
And yet, coming out of it, each one made their greatest film.
I believe a film should have something to say. I think it should make people think and feel long after they've left the theater.
Nothing could prepare anyone for the intensity of the conflict.
These filmmakers changed the world.
So I highly recommend. It's a docu-series that is very, very entertaining and very good. And I talk about that a little bit more in my lecture when I'm talking about my other video about the spiritual genres. But it's interesting how people started to react to this idea that nations, governments, could harness the power of cinema with this kind of authoritative voiceover, the expository style, right? You can basically put whatever kind of narrative you want over this image, and you can manipulate it to make who you want to look like the good guys look like the good guys, and who you want to look like the bad guys look like the bad guys, right? And so this was going on, right, in not only, you know, the incredibly manipulative films coming out of the 1930s in Germany, and the whole propaganda machine of Joseph Goebbels. But then even these filmmakers, these 5 American filmmakers that wound up making films for the War Department, were conflicted. John Huston was conflicted. He made a film called A Report from the Aleutians, I think it's called, the islands up near Alaska, and he lied in it. You know, he said that nobody was hurt, and all of the American boys made it home safe, when in fact some of those planes had been shot down, right? And then later on, when he was doing another film down in Italy, he recreated a battle scene and made it look real, but they weren't actually in combat, you know. So there was this kind of sense of some of these filmmakers saying, well, maybe the larger purpose of winning the war and the morale in the war is more important than the facts. Then it's okay to put a little lie in there, right? It's okay to kind of fudge things a little bit, to put reenactments that look like they happened, but they didn't. They were staged, you know, that sort of thing. And so in the 60s, you know, what you have here is this is the Maysles brothers here, very famous documentary duo. This is D.A. Pennebaker down here and here, filming Bob Dylan. Here's Al Maysles as an older man. And these filmmakers, the technology changed a bit, where you could have smaller cameras that were more observational, and you could record sound without the sound of the camera really messing things up, and you could record sort of on location on the street. And they came up with something called cinema verite, verite meaning truth. It's a fly-on-the-wall, observational, organic, no reenactments, no voiceovers, no manipulative music, right? Smaller cameras. And the idea was that they wanted to get to truth, to verite. They said, we're not doing the thing that the generation prior to us did, which is manipulate the facts. We're just observing. You know, we're not interpreting. Was kind of the sentiment. Like, we're not going to tell you what to think. We're not going to reenact anything, because we just want to show you what happens in front of the lens, right? So that's kind of the idea. And it was really a reaction to this movement of more propagandistic type of filming that was coming out of the war years, right? So the interest in this kind of a film, the power and meaning, you might say, from this kind of a film, comes from the choices that the filmmaker makes in the moment. It's a very organic, reactionary, instinctual form of filmmaking, right? So this is a clip from D.A. Pennebaker's film, Bob Dylan, Don't Look Back, a young Bob Dylan in the 1960s, filmed on 16mm black and white, following him and his crew around Europe as he was on tour, right? And I'm going to show you a scene, and you'll see that the points of interest in this scene are really, really different than what we saw in the Ken Burns scene, right? A different kind of energy, a different kind of way of interacting with it as a viewer. So I'll show you the clip and then we'll discuss.
mean, those kind, those a certain class of people. It's a class of people that take the magazine seriously. I mean, sure, I can read it, and I read it on the airplanes, but I don't take it seriously. If I want to find out anything, I'm not going to read Time magazine. I'm not going to read Newsweek. I'm not going to read any of these magazines. I mean, because they just got too much to lose by printing the truth. You know that.
What kinds of truths are they reading?
On anything, even on a worldwide basis. They just go off the stands in a day if they printed really the truth.
What is really the truth?
Really the truth is just a plain picture.
Do you care about what you're saying?
How can I answer that if you got the nerve to ask me?
Well, then you how can
I mean, you got a lot of nerve asking me a question like that.
I have to ask
Do you ask the Beatles that?
I have to ask you that because you have the nerve to question whether I care.
I'm not questioning you because I don't expect any answer from you. But do you think somebody wouldn't go see somebody if they didn't want entertainment?
Of course not.
Who wants to go get whipped, And if you do want to go get whipped, aren't you really being entertained?
All right, so fine.
Right? Okay, so do you think anybody that comes to see me is coming for any other reason except entertainment, really?
They'll tell you they're coming for different reasons.
Well, who cares what they tell you? Who cares what anybody
Well,
tells you?
they think they know why they're doing it.
Well, do you know why they're doing it?
I know some of the things.
People
they
say all kinds of things. You have to sort of weed it out. Can you weed it out?
What I'm trying to do. No, I don't.
Well, you see, you're not going to learn, but I can't teach you how to weed it out.
Well, I didn't say that I couldn't weed it out. I said I don't know yet.
All right. So, as you can see, very, very different. I really, really love D.A. Pennebaker as a filmmaker. Just the instincts that he has in the moment. Here you have a scene where really it's more up to me, the viewer, you, the viewer, to pick out what's significant about it, but you're subtly guided by the editing and by the what he chooses to include in the film, the frame, how he's filming it. This is Bob Dylan on tour, and he's kind of posturing a bit, and he's kind of dressing down this Newsweek. I don't know if he's from Newsweek or Time magazine or one of these reporters, and it's this poor sap's job to interview this young Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan decides that he doesn't believe in whatever this guy represents, right? And you can see it on his face, right? The frustration. He's getting embarrassed in front of all these people as Bob Dylan kind of tells him that he's not really authentic, And Bob Dylan is presenting himself as authentic, right? I'm the one who's the artist. I've got the soul of an artist. I'm telling the truth. I'm telling the plain picture. You, Mr. Newsweek man, you're manipulating things, and you're, in the pocket of the man or something like that. Kind of very, 1960s sentiment, right? So there's a lot going on in the scene, right? There's a lot of cultural, political, generational, philosophical things going on in the scene, but there's no narrator, there's no music except for what he plays in the scene, right? There's no background music to kind of tell us how to feel, right? There's no reenactments, right? None of that. It's just D.A. Pennebaker is in the room with the camera, focusing here and focusing there, right? And famously, when he finished filming for that movie, he didn't know how to edit it. And finally he decided, I'm just going to put it all more or less in order. He's still cutting out, all of the insignificant parts, right? There's still a notion here of significance versus insignificance, but he just put it pretty much in just chronological order, and people liked it. People watched it because Bob Dylan is an interesting person, and you want to see what he's doing and saying behind the scenes, backstage from his concerts, right? What is the man really like the person that we know as the artist, right? Maybe something like that. So this was kind of became the new more authentic, or supposedly more authentic way of documenting and interpreting reality with less of a heavy hand, right? But you still notice, though, that there is manipulation going on. It's not manipulation free. It's maybe you might say manipulation light, right? D.A. Pennebaker is still choosing what you're going to see by the way he frames the camera and by the way he edits everything. And there's a sense that Bob Dylan might be performing for the camera. So he's not staging anything, but let's be honest, Bob Dylan knows there's a camera in the room, knows there's a documentary crew there. And so part of his image that he wants to put forth as the authentic artist comes out in this performance. Is it really the real Bob Dylan? You know, we don't know. But it's certainly something that's interesting to watch, right? So in this case, the method is very different than the expository style, right? This method is to pick a subject and event, gain filming access, gain permission for filming, film and observe, and then edit the result in a non-heavy-handed way, presumably, right? So the emphasis is not on the past, like with Ken Burns, or the World War II propaganda films was an emphasis on sort of like interpreting the events for a political purpose, for good or ill, right? This is simply presenting some aspect of reality that the filmmaker finds interesting. And you might say that this one is sort of living in the moment, right? It's trying to react to what's going on in the present, right in front of your lens. So it's more instinctual form of filmmaking. So the emphasis is on production, on the present, rather than the past. Here's another example of quintessential cinema verite. This is the opening of Grey Gardens, which became a very, very famous film, a very successful film. I'll show you guys the beginning of it, and then we can discuss.
What are you doing down there? You standing there?
Just filming the main room.
Whiskers! Well, did you know that Whiskers has disappeared? A cat got out. I'm trying to get it in. We don't know how he got out. I think he got out in that hole up there. I knew they were coming. I think he got out in that hole. He could jump up there. Yeah. No, he got out that hole, he did. Yeah. We'll be raided again. We'll be raided again by the village of East Hampton. You know, they can get you in East Hampton for wearing red shoes on a Thursday and all that sort of thing. I don't know whether you know that. I mean, do you know that? They can get you for almost anything. It's the Maisel.
Hi, Edie. The gentleman callers.
I saw your car. One of my cats just
Edie,
ducked
you look
out.
fantastic.
David, you look absolutely terrific. Honestly, you've got light blue on. Well, Al, you're still. Mother says you're very conservative. Brooks, everything looks wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. This is the best thing to wear for the day. You understand?
Yeah.
Because I don't like women in skirts. And the best thing is to wear pantyhose or some pants under a short skirt, I think. Then you have the pants under the skirt. And then you can pull the stockings up over the pants underneath the skirt. And you can always take off the skirt and use it as a cape. So I think this is the best costume for today.
Okay.
I have to think these things up, you know. Mother wanted me to come out in a kimono, so we had quite a bite. So what did you do? Photograph Brooks cutting right down here?
Yachting through the jungle.
Oh, for goodness sakes. What do you want to do now? Where do you want to go? Upstairs? You want to go up and photograph it from the top porch?
Okay.
They're going to photograph from the top now, Brooks.
All right. So, this this film to me is just so well done. You know, one thing that you'll notice, and this is already happening in the 70s when they made this, is that the cinema verite style was already sort of well in play by the time the Maysles brothers made this film. And I'll just tell you a little bit in case you don't know. Jackie Kennedy Onassis, you know, her relatives lived in the Hamptons, which is the place where all of the wealthy people live outside of New York. And there was this old mansion called the Grey Gardens there that still had two women living in it that were aging, but they were poor. They had lost all their money, basically. And they were living in complete squalor. There were fleas everywhere. The house would spontaneously catch on fire. There were raccoons, and just the whole place was dilapidated. And the city of East Hampton was trying to kick them out, basically. And that's what you saw. Those newspaper articles were about, rather than using a voiceover, you know, rather than using a narrator to tell the story of why it came to be that Jackie Kennedy had to help clean up, put a bunch of money into cleaning up Grey Gardens, otherwise those two women would get evicted. They call her, you know, Big Edie and Little Edie, you know, the mother and daughter, right? And the Maysles brothers were trying to make a film about Jackie Kennedy, right? But instead, they thought, wow, this is much, much more interesting. And so they pivoted, and they wound up filming for 2 weeks at Grey Gardens and interviewing these two women, right? And if you look up interviews by Al Maysles, interviews that he did later in life after the popularity of this film, he really talks about the two women as with respect. You know, there's a real sense that you could have been making fun of them in some sense, or you could be exploiting them in some way, but instead he thought that there was something dignified, that there was a lot of grace and dignity that you saw here. And that's kind of what is interesting about the film, is that there's this juxtaposition between these two women that were raised in high society, that are very dignified and very elegant, but they don't have the money to back it up anymore. And so Edie Beale is constructing an outfit out of old clothing, a skirt out of a headscarf, or etc., right? And then she's still talking to the guy who's doing their garden, which is completely overgrown, saying, "Oh, thank you, Brooks. This is great. You know, you're doing a wonderful job." It's like they're barely surviving, right? But there's still this dignity and grace. And there's a scene later in the movie where they're putting on a record and they're singing and they're dancing to it, you know. And so there's a lot of cultural things going on. There's a lot of generational things going on. You know, what happens to women at that time when they lose their support from the husbands, and Edie Beale never married anyone, you know. So there's a lot of things going on. There's this kind of weird dysfunctional relationship between the mother and the daughter, where the daughter, you know, wishes that she could go to New York and be a performer, but she feels obligated to her mother, so she stays in the Hamptons, but she hates it in the Hamptons. You know, there's a lot of things going on. But one thing that you do notice is that they started talking from behind the camera, right? Did you notice that? She says, "Oh, the Maysles brothers are here," and then they say, "Oh, yeah, gentlemen callers," right? And there's a sense that maybe Edie has a crush on David, the one brother who does the sound, you know. So there's this now interaction between the subject and the observer, right? And this has always been kind of one of the conundrums about what they call the observer effect in anthropology, right? Is that when you observe, when you show up, you're changing what you're seeing, right? Because they're aware. Just like I was sort of hinting, Bob Dylan was aware that D.A. Pennebaker was in the room in Don't Look Back. In this case, they're just talking from behind the camera. They're saying, well, yeah, we're obviously here, so we might as well just include ourselves into the film. So what emerged after the cinema verite was this this sense of maybe it's even more true. Maybe you shouldn't be just a fly on the wall, but you should be someone who is aware that the subjects are aware of you, and include that in the film. Here's Al Maisels talking about sort of how he operates. This is a film called Salesman, and how he operates in navigating a scene that's happening in real time in front of him, and how to find the most interesting parts.
I don't think the way most cinematographers do, getting a wide shot and a close-up and a reaction shot and so forth. I see things the way I would as a person. And I think that helps the process for the person who watches it to feel a greater closeness to what's going on. The opening scene of Salesman is such a perfect kind of forecast of what's to come.
Which plan would be the best for you, the A, B, or C? You wouldn't want to...
Also such a perfect revelation of my camera work at its best. In the middle of that little scene, you see the child on the mother's lap yawning. And then it seems that it's exactly the right moment, but a moment totally chosen by the child, not by me. She goes over to the piano and knocks out a tune that Beethoven couldn't have created more appropriately for the mood.
I just couldn't afford it now. We would swamp with medical bills.
In the kind of shooting that I do, the smaller the team, the better able you'll be to, not interfere with the process that you're trying to shoot. So I think, it's best if the person who is the director is either doing sound or shooting and not just standing around and conducting, which, I just would want that person to be out of the room.
Yeah, so very interesting, right? The Salesman is just it's a tragedy, and in certain ways, it's a beautiful tragedy, right? These salesmen are tasked with going door to door, again in the 1970s, and selling ornate, expensive Catholic Bibles to families that can't afford them. And it's a doomed task in a lot of ways. It's a metaphor for futility, you might say, or something like that. And so when the Maisels brothers choose this subject, they're kind of looking, right? They're looking for emblematic anecdotes, right? So he talks about how this salesman is not going to make the sale, right? So it's about disappointment. And then he has the wherewithal to recognize that the tune that the little girl, the child, pounds out on the piano there is symbolic for the frustration that this salesman is feeling at the time. And that sets the tone for the rest of the film, where you sort of watch as this person's frustration grows and grows and grows until finally he snaps and yells at somebody, "What's wrong with you? Why won't you buy a Bible from me?" So it's very, very profound. I mean, it's the reason why these films are so, lasting through generations is because it's saying something about the human condition. So maybe there is, some manipulation going on, but it's a different kind of manipulation, right? So the main thing that happened after the 70s and after the Maisels were talking from behind the camera, right, is the evolution of the point of view genre of documentary, where it's basically like it's saying, okay, I'm not going to pretend that my point of view from my camera is completely without an agenda, right? It is my perspective. It's my point of view. I'm the one pointing the camera. I'm the one editing the film. I'm the one presenting it to you. And so I might as well be honest about that. And I might as well talk from behind the camera. I might as well include myself in the documentary film, right? So there's, again, this next generation is trying to find an even more authentic and even more honest way of using film to talk about reality. And so now the voiceover is put back into the film, right? But now it's the voice of the filmmaker. Now it's the voice of, here's why I'm telling you this, right? So it's not the authoritative narrator, right? It's not that sort of expository style. Now it's from the point of view of the filmmaker. They're watching the film with you almost. They're watching alongside of you. So the big person that sort of really brought this new style into vogue, you might say, in the early 80s, was a filmmaker called Ross McElwee. And this is the beginning of a famous film of his called Sherman's March. And see if you can spot when the switch from expository to point of view happens.
In 1864, during the American Civil War, Union General William T. Sherman began his famous March to the Sea. With an army of 60,000 men, he swept into the South, destroying Atlanta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, and dozens of smaller towns. His troops plundered homes, destroyed livestock, burned buildings, and left a path of destruction 60 miles wide and 700 miles long, before finally forcing a Confederate surrender in North Carolina. Sherman's campaign marked the first time in modern history that total warfare had been waged on a primarily civilian population, and traces of the scars he left on the South can still be found.
Great. Do you want to do it once more?
Do it all, yeah.
2 years ago, I was about to begin shooting a documentary film on the lingering effects of Sherman's march on the South. I'm from the South, and all through my childhood I heard stories about how Sherman had devastated the South. My aunt even keeps a sofa in her attic, which is punctured by sword holes put there by Sherman's soldiers as they searched for hidden valuables. She says she'll never allow the holes to be sewn up. Anyway, I'd just gotten a grant to make my film, and I stopped off in New York from Boston, where I live, to stay for a few days with the woman I'd been seeing. But when I arrived, she told me she'd just decided to go back to her former boyfriend. We argued, and then I left, and went to stay alone in a friend's studio loft, which happened to be vacant at the time. Finally, I headed south to see my family and to try to begin my film.
Okay. So, a meditation on the possibility of romantic love in the South during an era of nuclear weapons proliferation. So I don't know if you caught it, but the beginning of the film, right? It's starting out like an expository film. It's starting out with the authoritative voice of the narrator, and is talking about Sherman's March, right? And then it stops, and you pop into Ross McElway's world, right? Where he says, hey, okay, that sounded good. You want to do it one more time, right? And then it switches to Ross's voice, right? So now it's going from expository to point of view, right? And so Ross now is telling us what he thinks is interesting about this scenario, right? He is from the South, and the South carries the scars of the Civil War and carries the scars of a total war waged on a population, right? And he now carries those anxieties in his soul, right? It's part of his heritage, his legacy. And so now he's reflecting on the possibility of romantic love, right? And so now the rest of the film is him sort of tracing the pathway of Sherman's march through the South and just talking to whoever it is that he encounters along the way, right? So what's the most interesting part about this film? Well, it's whatever Ross McElway thinks is interesting, right? And so he became, a filmmaker that was known for this point of view style, right? So he would be someone who would say, okay, I'm going to go around the country and I'm going to be known as the guy who films everything. So he always had a 16 millimeter camera on his shoulder. And in all Ross McElway films, you see him going around and talking to people, and everyone's just talking to him with the camera on his shoulder, right? And it's from his point of view. This is a clip from a really great film. I just wish that it was on a streaming service or something, but it's called The 6 O'Clock News, and it's something that he did for PBS's Frontline in, I think, the mid-90s. And it's a reflection on the nature of, again, trying to find out the most authentic way to present something filmically. So he's reflecting on the news. He's reflecting on what's the difference between what I do, which is a filmmaker showing you things from my point of view, which he feels, or that generation anyway, of filmmakers felt is the most authentic way to look at reality, is from a particular viewpoint, right? Versus what people in the news do. And it's so poignant because it really relates to if the news was this way in 1990, in the mid-90s, right? It's that way times 10 today due to our technology that we have today. So here's a little clip from that I think you'll enjoy.
This is the version of reality I'm more familiar with. I make documentary films for a living, and I also like to film everyday life, including my own life. I've become kind of obsessed with making these autobiographical home movies. But I keep wondering about the real world, the world of the 6 o'clock news.
Officials are reluctant to call the blaze part of an attempted suicide, but sources say the youth had taken...
The people in these stories, suddenly, due to a twist of fate, the 6 o'clock news becomes their home movie, a movie they never wanted made. Maybe it's because we've just had a kid, but lately the real world seems to be a lot more dangerous than it used to be. It's supposed to be real life, what we see on the news, but it seems increasingly unreal to me. All those stories, each with its own strange, tragic twist. What I think I need to do is somehow plunge directly into the territory held by the 6 o'clock news. I decide to take my camera on the road for a while.
All right, so it's really fascinating. He wants to explore this, right? And so what does he do? He he goes to the different news events. He goes to a site where there was a tornado, and he stands next to all of the people there, all the news reporters that are covering this trailer park that was destroyed by a tornado. And he tries to get an interview with the same people, right? On the news people, they all pack up and leave. They've gotten what they wanted, right? They want a story, they get the story, they move on. He hangs out, and he ends up getting invited into their home or their neighbor's home, and so that they can watch themselves on the 6 o'clock news, right? He goes to California after the Northridge earthquake, and he spends a few days with a man that was trapped in a parking garage for a number of hours, unable to move, and finally rescued, right? And the news people came, and you really get this sense that there's this exploitative nature to the news industry, right? They need to get this story, they get it, and they're out, right? So he hung out with that guy for another 3 days after the news story broke to get a little bit more understanding of what his life is like now. And the news is kind of this weird blip in his experience. And then he goes back to his ordinary life where he doesn't really have a job anymore, and now he's injured on top of it, and he's got medical bills, et cetera, et cetera. So that little bit of fame really didn't do him any good. And then the larger public, that's just whatever they were thinking about and watching that day. And once he's not in the news anymore, do they care about him? Not really. So Ross McElway is kind of exploring this whole thing. What is the obligation that someone has when they're sticking a camera in their face to form a relationship with that person? Is it just a disinterested, dispassionate, unmotivated relationship, or should there be some kind of a friendship that develops? Generally, like in the world of journalism, you're not supposed to develop a relationship with those that you are documenting, right? You're supposed to be disinterested. You're supposed to be objective, right? But Ross McElway is questioning that. He's saying, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm a human being, and I'm here with my camera. I'm affecting how you're reacting to things because I have a camera. Don't I have kind of an obligation to form a relationship with you, right? So that's kind of what the point of view evolution was playing with, right? I'm a human being and an artist, and so maybe that's what I should be exploring. My experience of encountering things and people and events in the world, right? Get back to here, and all right. So the point of view method is blending of filming and research, working out the narrative, and using personal voiceover, and it's a definitely an anything goes kind of thing. I would say that the inheritor, perhaps, although he's probably around the same age, so it's not necessarily an inheritor, but Werner Herzog here. A very, very famous filmmaker that we're going to talk about a little bit later in another video. He kind of took and adopted that point of view style and really, really made it sing, I would say. Okay, so that's these different genres are different sort of techniques of documenting reality, different techniques of getting to truth. And you can see how each one of these filmmakers has a theory on how they are getting to the best truth that they know how. Ken Burns does it with the expository style. D.A. Pennebaker and the Maisels do it with the cinema verite style. Ross McElway and Werner Herzog do it with the point of view style. And now the quintessential filmmaker that does it with interview is Errol Morris. And so this is also a way of trying to get at truth, a way at trying to get at reality. But rather than doing it with observational verite filmmaking or with taking historical clippings from the past, it's done with conversation. It's done with the interview. So here's Errol Morris talking about sort of how he thinks, how he sees the power and meaning of the interview process or the interview film playing out.
The question of how you frame an interview, how you photograph an interview, how you cut an interview is all really up for grabs and very, very interesting.
What is at the heart of this? This is the only job you've ever had.
It's a more complex phenomenon than you might think.
I'm learning about things I am really fascinated.
I was thinking about the Interrotron before I even became a filmmaker. I certainly was aware of this whole issue of eye contact.
That's good. If you come in and you're totally clinical.
How could I get the person I was interviewing to look at me and look right into the lens at the same time? And the answer is mirrors. Prompters cross-connected, 2 cameras. My image is floating on the lens, but the camera is looking straight through that image at the person. It makes The Fog of War a different kind of film. You're really scrutinizing McNamara, and McNamara is talking directly to you in the audience.
He, and I'd say I, were behaving as war criminals.
I don't even think it was clear to me at the time that I was making it how powerful that actually could be.
So, yeah, here's a whole nother way, a whole nother method at getting at truth, right? At getting at authenticity. And in this case, the technique is finding a way to get at the truth of a person, right? So there's this sense that we all wear masks. You know, we all present the view of ourselves that we want to the public. And the task of the interview-based filmmaker, in a sense, is to find the real person underneath, you know, the authentic person, and reveal that in some way, reveal some truth about themselves, but also a truth about us, about humanity, with the conducting of this interview. And so he's using all of these different techniques, right? One of the techniques is this thing called the Interrotron, where Errol Morris is sitting over here, right, and he's looking into a half mirror with this person's image, and this person who he's interviewing sitting over here, looking at Errol Morris's image reflected here. I'm actually using an Interrotron right now. I've got my image reflected right here, right there. And I'm looking at the screen with my slideshow and my image of myself. So I'm looking basically straight in the lens. If I were to be looking at my computer screen, I'd be looking over here, right? And so there's a real connection when you're looking someone in the eye. So he was talking about a film called The Fog of War. Fog of War was a groundbreaking Academy Award-winning film, and it was about Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense under Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, right? And I think he actually started with Kennedy. So he was right there with Henry Kissinger and everybody during the Vietnam War, right? And so this interview wound up lasting like 3 days, right? And he filmed it with a lot of different camera angles and used this haunting Philip Glass score and to kind of like dramatize and kind of like allow us to kind of seep in this stew of conversation and reflection and historical footage about this historical event. So this is not really expository, right? There's no voiceover. It's not really cinema verite, right? It's not really point of view, but there is some manipulation going on. There is some reenactments going on. There's historical B-roll going on. There's music that maybe not the kind of music that's telling you how to feel, but to kind of dramatize the events. And it's very compelling. You know, it's very interesting. Here's a little clip from Fog of War that I think will help illustrate this.
In that single night, we burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo, men, women, and children.
Were you aware this was going to happen?
Well, I was part of a mechanism that in a sense recommended it. I analyzed bombing operations and how to make them more efficient, i.e., not more efficient in the sense of killing more, but more efficient in weakening the adversary. I wrote one report analyzing the efficiency of the B-29 operations. The B-29 could get above the fighter aircraft and above the air defense, so the loss rate would be much less. The problem was the accuracy was also much less. Now, I don't want to suggest that it was my report that led to, I'll call it the firebombing. It isn't that I'm trying to absolve myself of blame for the firebombing. I don't want to suggest that it was I that put in LeMay's mind that his operations were totally inefficient and had to be drastically changed. But anyhow, that's what he did. He took the B-29s down to 5,000 feet, and he decided to bomb with firebombs. I participated in the interrogation of the B-29 bomber crews that came back that night. A room full of crewmen and intelligence interrogators. The captain got up, young captain, and said, "God damn it, I'd like to know who this son of a bitch was that took this magnificent airplane designed to bomb from 23,000 feet, and he took it down to 5,000 feet, and I lost my wingman. He was shot and killed." LeMay spoke in monosyllables. I never heard him say more than 2 words in sequence. It was basically, yes, no, yep. That's all right, hell with it. That was all he said. And LeMay was totally intolerant of criticism. He never engaged in discussion with anybody. He stood up. Why are we here? Why are we here? You lost your wingman. It hurts me as much as it does you. I sent him there. And I've been there. I know what it is. But you lost one wingman, and we destroyed Tokyo. "50 square miles of Tokyo were burned. Tokyo was a wooden city, and when we dropped these firebombs, and it just burned it.
You should watch the film if you want to see more of that. But you can sort of see how this how this works. He's putting together kind of a tapestry within which we can reflect on these events that really need reflecting upon, right? We want to know what are the mistakes that we can avoid that were made during and after World War II and during Vietnam, right? We want to know, was there blame? We want to know, was there a misunderstanding that could have been avoided? Was there blind spots? All these kind of things. And he's not telling us necessarily, he's not outright telling us what to think, but he's providing details of the different anecdotes that McNamara is referring to, such as the reports and the historical B-roll, the severity of these fire bombings, and then the moral calculus that McNamara is making between what he was considering at the time to be necessary sacrifices for to prevent a far worse outcome. These different sort of, all of that stuff is going on in the film, and Errol Morris is trying to provide this frame, provide this platform within which we can reflect upon that. Does it involve manipulation? Yes. He's choosing what parts of the conversation to show. He's choosing what B-roll to show. He's choosing the music. He's choosing all that stuff. But he will tell you, that he is trying not to manipulate you to think a certain way. Like, he doesn't necessarily want you to agree with what he thinks about these historical events. He wants to present, kind of like what Ken Burns was saying earlier, a complex reality that we have to wrestle with in some sense. A complex reality that doesn't have easy answers, right? It would be easy to make perhaps something that just portrays this man as a war criminal, right? But Errol Morris is famous for doing interviews and entire films with people that don't necessarily agree with him, or that he doesn't necessarily agree with them, but yet they still see him as a fair interview, right? And so they agree to do it, right? So it's very, very interesting, how how this dynamic plays out, right? So the method for the interview style, and this is a very, very popular style of documentary, is to do the research, pick the subject, gain permission, and then interview with a purpose. And really, there's a skill with conducting an interview. In fact, I think probably when I teach documentary in college, one of the main things to talk about is what your interview techniques and strategies are going to be. Because again, you want to get at the truth. You don't necessarily want to just get the PR that this person is putting forward, the mask that they wear, the public persona that they want. You want something true about the person, right? You want to be able to have something as an audience member that you can reflect on. Have something that you can see something about the human condition through this conversation, right? So that's why his interviews often, last for 3 days, etc. So that's another sort of major category in documentary film, and we have one more, and then we're done. I really, really appreciate your stamina in this. Okay, so the final category is the abstract poetic style of documentary. This is a style that is going to be very different from the rest, and I think it comes more out of the world of fine art than it does any of these other sort of journalistic-based origins of documentary film. So it's going to be probably more non-narrative. probably less formal logic, more informal, mood-based, and experiential. Kind of more like something that you might encounter in a museum rather than in the cinema, usually, right? So this is a film by Godfrey Riggio called Visitors. And I'm just going to show you a little bit so you can kind of see what's going on. So Godfrey is famous for doing abstract pieces like this that are involving time manipulation. He has a very, very famous piece that's all time-lapse. You know, lots of different cities and different parts of the world, time-lapse, right? In this case, really the point of the piece is to put you in a meditative space, right? Put you in a kind of a contemplative space when you go to the theater to watch it, where you're seeing the human face in slow motion, in black and white, over and over and over and over, until finally you stop sort of seeing those faces the way you normally would, and you start to see it as if you're an outsider, and you're looking at these human beings as if you're an alien, right? That's kind of like, what is their deal? What is the deal with the human race? You know, and it's really supposed to be an experiential thing. You know, supposed to be contemplative, meditative. He's using Philip Glass, same composer as Errol Morris, but it's supposed to be a bit of a surreal experience, maybe even kind of a sublime experience that the filmmaker is attempting to create. So what makes it a documentary? Nothing other than the fact that these are real people, right? But the setup is not, it's not journalistic in like the sense that we've seen in these other things. It's not historical. It's a unique artistic portrait-like art, perspective on the human face, study in the human face, you might say. So, this is a very different way. All right, so here's another example of the same thing. So what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to your mental state when you're watching that for 90 minutes in a dark theater, right? There's a sense that you are going to eventually let go of any expectation for a narrative to take place, right? And you're going to slip into this other state. You know, I kind of like to think of it as almost like a guidance in a meditation. You know, the film itself is inviting you to have this meditative experience and to kind of contemplate, embrace, question these mysteries, you know, the wonder of the world, right? We tend to take things for granted, you know. That's almost like the default state of mind in the human condition, right? Just 2 generations ago, people dreamed of flying and how amazing it would be to fly. And, you know, when I fly, I'm upset if I don't get my meal or my snack or my drink fast enough, right? And I'm upset because there's people in my way. I don't even look out the window, right? When I fly on a plane, you know, this wondrous thing, this absolute miracle that I can experience very easily, that 2 generations ago people would have died for, literally, right? That's the state that we are. We always have, and this is, you can find this in research in positive psychology, a baseline where you just take for granted everything that you have, and then you're only sort of happy or satisfied or get a dopamine hit or whatever when you get a little bit more than what your baseline is. But then when you get a little bit less, like me on the plane, when I'm sitting next to a person I don't want to sit next to, or I'm slightly uncomfortable or something like that, or I'm slightly delayed, right? I fall all the way down here in my happiness level. I think that films like this that take reality and present it in another light have a way of kind of like resetting that baseline, right? So that I'm more aware of all of the things that I take for granted. You know, that's just one possible scenario with a film like this, but it could be other things. It might be different for you, the way that you experience one of those films. You might come to some profound insight, right? But there is this sense, which I think is true, that going into a meditative process like that is creating space for some profound insight, for you to have some kind of a profound insight, right? So again, each one of these genres, I like to think of it as a gift. You know, the gift of Ken Burns is digging through the past, looking for emblematic anecdotes that are going to be relevant to you today, right? And he does all the work for that, and then he presents it to you, right? When he makes his baseball documentary, for example. The cinema verite documentarian, The Gift, what's the gift of that? Well, they're going and they're filming hours and hours and hours and hours, and they're picking out the relevant anecdotes to present to you that would be relevant to you today, right? To your life, right? The point of view filmmaker is going out and exploring the world, exploring reality, and then coming back and telling you what they found, right? The interview filmmaker is creating a tapestry for us to be able to think about events or think about things or get to know people or scrutinize people or whatever it is, scrutinize the human condition. And then these poetic pieces really are there to allow space for you to do this kind of meditative practice, right? And the music is there for that. The visuals are there for that. And, you know, one of the few places left in our society, in our modern non-religious society, where you can actually have contemplative space is in the movie theater. You know, think of the fact that the curtains and the people and the chairs dampen the outside sound. It's very quiet in the movie theater, and there's a certain ritual of finding your seat, right? And so these filmmakers have found that it's a real opportunity to create something that will help people engage in a more meditative, dare I say, spiritual practice, right? There's a book called Movies Are Prayers, which is a great book. It's a theology and film book, but it's this idea that he's not talking necessarily about documentary film, but that there's a prayer-like function, to film. So, those are the categories. The approach to this style, the method for this style, is you approach it more like a fine art project, right? Where you're sort of establishing rules. Godfrey he basically says, okay, I'm going to film a bunch of human faces in slow motion, in black and white, and I'm going to find ways to present those, so I can put people in this kind of observational state of mind, right? Or I'm going to go around and find a bunch of things to time lapse, pair it with music, and create this sort of meditative experience for people, right? And this is a very popular one among my students, is to do some kind of a fine art type of a project, and use that as a kind of a way of exploring a certain aspect of reality. Okay, so what did we talk about today? We talked about these different historical styles: expository, cinema verite, point of view, interview, and abstract. There's a sense that they kind of developed and emerged throughout the history of film, emerged historically. But the one thing that was in common with all of these different pieces is some way, some method of getting at truth, right? At getting underneath the surface of reality, right? Finding that profundity, finding that sublimity, like finding what is real, and also finding what is meaningful, finding the anecdotes, finding the facts, finding the examples, crafting an experience to help us make sense of our lives, to help us make sense of the human condition. And so that's why I say that this is a real window into what it is we do as human beings in general when we make sense of our lives, right? This is a certain art form that really lends itself to the study of meaning making, So that's a brief history of documentary film, and that's my pitch to you, that documentary film is worth your while, especially if you want to find meaning, you want to find purpose, you want to understand the human condition. This art form is very apt in that regard. So thanks for watching, and check back, and we will do more discussions about documentary film soon.